Imagine this. You wake up in the morning and before your feet even touch the ground, your mind has already traveled 1,000 miles. What if today doesn't go well? What if I fail? What if I get sick, lose someone I love, or the world turns against me? That little voice inside, sometimes soft, sometimes deafening, doesn't stop. And what's even stranger, the more we worry, the more we feel like we're in control, when in reality, worry gives us the illusion of control while quietly stealing our peace. This is the paradox of worry. We think it protects us from the unknown, but it actually chains us to suffering we don't need to carry. Buddhist teachings remind us that the mind is like a restless monkey, swinging endlessly from one thought to another, rarely resting. Worry is one of its favorite branches. It tells us we're preparing for danger, but most of the dangers it screams about never arrive. It's like standing under an umbrella on a sunny day, convinced the rain is coming. Day after day, we exhaust ourselves waiting for storms that never appear. But here's the truth. Worry doesn't prevent suffering, it multiplies it. When something difficult finally does happen, we suffer twice. First in our imagination and then again in reality. So why do we hold on to worry as if it's a lifeline? Because somewhere deep down, we mistake it for care. We think worrying about our children, our work, our future means we love, we're responsible, we're prepared. But love doesn't have to be tangled with fear. Responsibility doesn't have to be burdened with anxiety. And preparation doesn't have to cost us peace of mind. The Buddha once taught that clinging to unhelpful thoughts is like holding onto a burning coal, expecting it to harm someone else. In truth, it only burns us. Worry is that burning coal. We hold it tighter and tighter, hoping it will make us safe, yet it only leaves scars. And still, many of us hesitate to let go of worry because the moment we try, fear whispers, if I stop worrying, won't everything fall apart? This is where the paradox deepens. By letting go of worry, we don't lose control, we gain clarity. We free our energy for calm, focused action instead of endless overthinking. In this journey we're about to take together, we'll explore how to train the mind to step out of worry's shadow. We'll see how Buddhist wisdom can turn fear into awareness, doubt into insight, and restlessness into peace. Because life is short. And the precious moments we have were never meant to be wasted on imagining 100 possible disasters that may never come. They were meant to be lived, fully, clearly, and deeply. So, as we begin, let's hold this paradox gently in our hearts. Worry feels like protection, but in truth, it's the very weight that keeps us from flying. Have you ever noticed how quickly things change? One moment the sky is bright and clear, and in the blink of an eye, dark clouds roll in. One day your body feels strong and full of energy, and the next you find yourself struggling to climb a simple flight of stairs. This is the reality of life. Everything is in motion, nothing stays still. The Buddha taught that all things are impermanent. Not just people, not just seasons, but everything. Your thoughts, your emotions, your possessions, your relationships, even your very body are all constantly shifting. And yet, even though deep down we know this, we resist it. We cling. We try to hold on as if the world owes us permanence, as if youth will last forever, as if love will never fade, as if health will never decline. But here's the paradox. It's not impermanence that causes us pain. It's our refusal to accept it. Think about it. When you buy a new phone, you know it won't last forever. Technology moves forward, screens crack, batteries wear out. You wouldn't rage at the phone for betraying you. It's simply the way things are. And yet when it comes to people, moments, or even our own life stages, we resist the same truth. Impermanence can feel frightening. It reminds us that nothing is guaranteed, that time is passing, and that we are not in control. But it also carries a hidden gift. Because if things were permanent, if nothing ever changed, growth would be impossible. A seed would never become a flower. A broken heart would never heal. A struggling person would never find hope. Change is what makes life possible. In fact, impermanence is the very reason joy can exist. The laughter of a child is precious because you know they won't stay that little forever. A sunset is breathtaking because you know it lasts only for a moment. Even suffering is temporary, it cannot hold you forever. The Buddha once said, "This too shall pass." Simple words, but they carry the weight of freedom. So how do we live with impermanence without drowning in fear of loss? We start by shifting how we see it. Instead of grasping, we learn to appreciate. Instead of clinging, we learn to let things flow. Think of your life like a river. You cannot step into the same river twice, because the water is always moving, always new. If you try to dam it up, it grows stagnant. But if you allow it to flow, you discover its beauty, its freshness, its life-giving force. Take a moment to reflect. What are you holding on to right now that is already changing? Maybe it's your youth. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's an identity you've built for yourself. The truth is, you cannot stop the river, but you can learn to float with it. When you embrace impermanence, worry begins to loosen its grip. Why? Because so much of our worry is about holding on to money, to reputation, to people, to control. But when you understand that change is the rule, not the exception, you stop fighting it. And in that surrender, a deep peace begins to appear. Think of a flower blooming in the spring. You admire it knowing it will not last. But that doesn't make its beauty less real, it makes it more real. Its impermanence gives it meaning. Life is no different. Every breath you take, every conversation, every sunrise, each one is a passing miracle. So instead of worrying about when it will end, why not live it while it's here? Impermanence is not something to fear, it's a call to presence. A reminder to love fully, to live deeply, to be here now. Because once this moment passes, it will never return. Why do we suffer, even when life seems to be going well? Why is it that the more we gain, the more restless we become? The Buddha pointed to a single piercing truth. Suffering arises from attachment and desire. Not from life itself, not from the world around us, but from the way our minds cling, grasp, and crave what we believe will complete us. Think about it. Every time you say, "I'll finally be happy when," you've tied your peace of mind to a condition outside of yourself. Maybe it's money, love, respect, or even something as simple as a moment of comfort. And when you finally get it, what happens? The joy flickers, brief, intoxicating, and then fades. Almost immediately, a new desire appears. The cycle begins again. It's like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. Attachment takes many forms. Some people attach to material possessions, believing their worth is measured by what they own. Others attach to relationships, convinced that someone else must be the source of their happiness. Many attach to ideas, identities, or even the illusion of control. And yet in every case, what is held onto with desperation eventually slips away. The world changes, people change, you change. That's why clinging is always painful. When life gives us what we want, we fear losing it. When life denies us what we want, we grow frustrated. And even when we stand still, the mind continues to whisper, more, more, more. But here lies the liberating truth. Desire itself isn't the enemy. To want food when you're hungry or rest when you're tired is natural. The suffering begins when wants become chains, when they dictate your worth and bind your happiness to outcomes you can't control. Consider this. Imagine holding a bird in your hand. If you hold too loosely, it may fly away. If you hold too tightly, you'll crush it. True peace comes from holding life gently, appreciating what you have, but not squeezing it with fear. The Buddha's teaching of non-attachment doesn't mean indifference. It doesn't mean you can't love, create, or aspire. It means you engage with life fully, but without clinging. You love without trying to possess. You enjoy without demanding permanence. You give without expecting return. When you live this way, you discover a freedom that cannot be taken from you. A freedom that allows you to enjoy the beauty of the world without being enslaved by it. A freedom that transforms suffering into wisdom. And when you begin to release the grip of attachment, something extraordinary happens. The endless cycle of craving weakens. The mind softens. A quiet joy, deeper and more stable than any temporary pleasure, emerges. It's this gentle yet profound shift that prepares us to look even deeper into the human experience. Because if attachment is the root of suffering, then the question naturally arises. Who is it that clings? Who is it that suffers? If impermanence teaches us that everything changes, and if attachment reveals how our desires bind us to suffering, then the next step is to ask, who exactly is the one that suffers? When fear arises, when worry takes over, when anxiety grips our chest, who is it that feels afraid? We often say, I am scared, I am worried, I am suffering. But if we look deeper, Buddhism points us to a radical question. Where is this I? The Buddha's teaching of anatta, no self, is perhaps the most challenging and liberating of all truths. Unlike impermanence, which we can see in falling leaves or in our aging reflection, the idea of no self shakes the very foundation of our existence. We have been conditioned to believe that there is a permanent, solid me living inside this body and mind. A me that thinks, loves, fears, wins, loses, ages, and eventually dies. But when we investigate carefully, this self cannot be found. Think about it. Your body changes constantly. The cells in your skin die and renew. The hair you cut continues to grow. The body you called mine at 5 years old is completely different from the one you live in at 50, yet we still insist it is the same me. Your mind is no different. The thoughts you held yesterday are gone. The beliefs you had as a child may seem naive now. The emotions rise and fall like waves on the shore. The you who was once angry yesterday is no longer angry now. So, who is this constant self we cling to? The Buddha compared the self to a chariot. When you look at a chariot, you see one object. But when you take it apart, wheels, axle, wood, harness, there is no single chariot. It is only a collection of parts working together. In the same way, what we call the self is simply a collection of body, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness. These parts arise and pass away according to conditions, but nowhere in them is there a permanent, unchanging I. So then, who is afraid? Fear arises as a natural reaction in the mind. It is not your fear, it is just fear. Worry arises as a thought pattern conditioned by past experiences. It is not your worry, it is simply worry. When we cling to these passing states and label them as mine, suffering deepens. But when we see them as they are, temporary, conditioned, and impersonal, we begin to loosen the grip. Imagine a storm. When fear arises, we feel as if we are the storm itself, tossed in every direction. But when we realize, this is just a storm passing through the sky of the mind, we no longer fight. The sky does not cling to the clouds. It simply allows them to drift and dissolve. In the same way, our true nature is like the sky, vast, open, unbound. Fear, anger, desire, they are just clouds. The mistake is thinking the clouds define the sky. This teaching is not meant to deny our experience, but to free us from being enslaved by it. If there is no solid self, then who is left to cling, who is left to be broken, who is left to carry the burden of endless worry? The illusion of self is the root of fear. Because we think there is a permanent me that can be harmed, we live in constant defense. But when we see that the self is just a flow of conditions, fear loses its power. This does not mean we stop living or become passive. In fact, life becomes more vivid, more compassionate. If there is no fixed self, then the boundaries between me and you soften. Your pain is not separate from mine. Your joy is not apart from mine. Realizing the illusion of self is also realizing our deep interconnection with all beings. From this wisdom arises great compassion. So next time you feel afraid, pause and ask, who is afraid? Look inside. You may find that what you thought was you is only sensations, thoughts, memories, and conditions rising and falling. Fear itself becomes a teacher, pointing you to the empty nature of self. And in that emptiness, you discover a freedom that no worry can touch. If impermanence is the ground of life and attachment is the seed of suffering, then mindfulness is the path that helps us walk with clarity, balance, and freedom. It is not a new invention or a passing wellness trend. Mindfulness has been the very heart of Buddhist practice for over 500 years, and it remains the most practical tool for anyone who wants to live more deeply, more peacefully, and more awake. At its core, mindfulness is simple: to return to the present moment, fully aware of what is happening within and around us, without judgment or clinging. But though the definition is simple, the practice requires patience and persistence because our minds are restless, always chasing after what is past or grasping at what is yet to come. The Buddha once compared the human mind to a monkey, leaping from branch to branch, never satisfied, never still. Left untrained, the mind is pulled endlessly by desires, fears, and habits. But through mindfulness, we can gently bring the mind home, anchoring it in the reality of this moment. Mindfulness is not about controlling thoughts or forcing silence. It is about cultivating awareness. When you breathe in, you know you are breathing in. When you walk, you know you are walking. When a feeling arises, whether joy or sorrow, you recognize it without being swept away. In this recognition, space is created, and in that space lies freedom. Think of the difference between being caught in a storm and watching the storm from the safety of a shelter. The winds still blow, the rain still falls, but you are not destroyed by them. Mindfulness gives us that shelter. Life will still bring difficulties, but instead of reacting blindly, we respond with wisdom. One of the most powerful aspects of mindfulness is how it transforms ordinary moments into sacred ones. Drinking a cup of tea, washing your hands, listening to a loved one. These simple acts, when done with full awareness, become gateways to peace. Suddenly, you are no longer rushing through life. You are living it. Modern science now echoes what the Buddha taught long ago. Mindfulness reduces stress, improves concentration, strengthens emotional regulation, and even supports physical health. But beyond these measurable benefits, its greatest gift is awakening. Each mindful breath is a reminder. This life is precious, this moment is enough. When mindfulness deepens, we begin to see the truth more clearly. We notice the impermanent nature of all things, the way suffering arises and passes, the illusion of a fixed self. And through this clear seeing, compassion naturally blooms. Because when you are present with your own pain and joy, you can also be present with the pain and joy of others. To live mindfully is not to escape the world, but to engage with it more fully, with open eyes and an open heart. It is to walk gently, to listen deeply, and to act with kindness. It is to realize that happiness is not found somewhere in the future, but here, in this breath, in this step, in this smile. Mindfulness is the art of coming home, to yourself, to life, to reality as it is. Every time you return to the present moment, you water the seeds of peace. And with enough watering, peace becomes your natural state. So the invitation is simple. Pause, breathe, return. Your life is happening now. Don't miss it. If impermanence is the foundation of the Buddha's teaching, meditation is the key that allows us to see it not as an idea, but as a living truth. Reading about impermanence or listening to Dharma talks can inspire us, but unless we turn inward and directly observe the arising and passing away of phenomena within our own body and mind, it remains merely intellectual knowledge. The Buddha did not want us to simply believe him. He wanted us to look for ourselves. Meditation is that looking, that direct seeing. When we sit in meditation, we begin by observing something simple like the breath. At first, the breath may feel like a steady stream. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. But as awareness deepens, we notice subtler changes. Each inhale is slightly different from the last. Each exhale vanishes as soon as it is completed. The body is never still. Sensations flicker, pulse, and dissolve. The mind, too, is in constant flux. Thoughts arise, persist for a moment, and fade away. Even emotions, which often feel so solid and overwhelming, reveal themselves as temporary guests. Anger burns, then cools. Joy blossoms, then wanes. This direct observation is the beginning of insight. It is no longer impermanence as philosophy, but impermanence as direct perception. Suddenly, we see that everything we cling to, our feelings, our identities, our possessions, is not fixed, but changing moment to moment. The Buddha described this insight as seeing reality as it truly is. It is like standing on the shore of a river and realizing that the water before you is never the same. It flows, shifts, and disappears. Through consistent practice, meditation reveals three marks of existence: impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. When we see that nothing lasts, we also realize that clinging leads to suffering, because we try to hold on to what is already slipping away. And when we see that even the self is a flow of sensations, thoughts, and perceptions without a permanent core, the fear of losing that self begins to dissolve. Meditation is not about escaping reality or entering a trance. It is about becoming intimate with the reality of change. Each moment on the cushion is an opportunity to train the mind to stay present with impermanence, without resistance. Over time, this deep seeing gives rise to wisdom and compassion. We learn not to grasp, not to push away, but to dwell peacefully in the ever-changing now. The Buddha often compared meditation to polishing a mirror. At first, our view is clouded by dust, the dust of ignorance, desire, and aversion. But as we practice, the dust falls away and the mirror reflects things as they truly are. In this clear seeing, impermanence is not frightening, it is liberating. Because if everything is changing, then nothing is stuck forever. Pain, sadness, and confusion will also pass. And in this passing, there is hope, freedom, and the possibility of awakening. If we look deeply, compassion and letting go are not two separate practices. They are two wings of the same bird, carrying us across the stormy sea of suffering. Compassion without letting go can become attachment. Letting go without compassion can turn into cold detachment. Only when they move together do they reveal the true power of the Buddha's teachings. Compassion means feeling the suffering of others as if it were our own. But to truly practice compassion, we must also release our own grasping, our demand that others be a certain way, our hidden expectation that our kindness should be repaid, our fear that if we let go, we will lose something essential. Many times we try to help, but beneath our help lies attachment. We want the other to be happy according to our plan, not theirs. In such moments, we are not freeing anyone. We are tying them down with our own desires. Letting go, on the other hand, is often misunderstood as indifference or rejection. But true letting go is born of wisdom and love. It does not push people away, it gives them space to grow. It does not deny care, it offers freedom. When a parent finally loosens their grip on a child's choices, it does not mean they love less. It means their love has matured, recognizing that each being must walk their own path. The Buddha often used the metaphor of holding a bird in your hands. Hold it too tightly, and you harm it. Hold it too loosely, and it may fly away before it is ready. True compassion is holding with care, but letting go at the right time. We help, we guide, we offer kindness, but we do not cling. Meditation shows us how to balance these two. When we sit quietly and watch our breath, we notice thoughts, feelings, and memories arise. Some are pleasant, some are painful. If we cling to them, we suffer. If we push them away harshly, we also suffer. But when we meet them with compassion, acknowledging their presence, understanding why they arise, and then gently let them pass, we discover the middle way. The same practice applies to how we treat people and experiences in daily life. Compassion without letting go creates chains. Letting go without compassion creates emptiness. Together, they create freedom. This is why the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokitesvara, is often depicted with 1,000 arms and hands, each hand reaching out to help, but none grasping to possess. In the end, compassion and letting go teach us the same truth. Love is not about owning, controlling, or demanding. Love is about understanding and releasing. When we let go, we do not stop loving. In fact, our love becomes purer, freer, and stronger. Impermanence is often misunderstood as something to fear, as if it only brings endings, loss, and sorrow. But the Buddha taught that impermanence, far from being a curse, is the very reason life is precious. Imagine a flower that never withers, a sunset that never fades, or a song that never ends. Would you still feel the same awe, the same gratitude, the same urgency to treasure them? It is precisely because things pass that they shine with meaning. Impermanence in its essence is a gift. When we deeply realize impermanence, we no longer cling desperately to what cannot last, nor do we despair when life shifts unexpectedly. Instead, we begin to flow with change, like a river that dances around stones, never stagnant, always alive. A heart that embraces change is not crushed by endings, but awakened to beginnings. In relationships, impermanence reminds us to cherish the people we love now, instead of waiting until it's too late. Every smile, every conversation, every shared silence becomes sacred because we know it will not last forever. Rather than fearing loss, we let impermanence teach us love in its purest form. Love that does not demand possession, love that bows to the truth of passing time. In times of difficulty, impermanence whispers hope. No storm lasts forever, no grief is permanent, no pain is eternal. When we suffer, we can remember, this too shall pass. And when we are happy, we can bow with gratitude, knowing that joy too is fleeting and therefore infinitely precious. The gift of impermanence is freedom. Freedom from clinging to what must change, freedom from despair when change arrives, freedom to live this moment fully. To embrace impermanence is to embrace life itself, with all its colors, textures, and rhythms. The Buddha once compared life to a dewdrop on a blade of grass, sparkling briefly at sunrise before disappearing. Yet in that fleeting moment, it reflects the entire sky. Our lives too may be brief, but if we live with awareness, with compassion, and with an open heart, they can reflect the vast beauty of existence. To embrace impermanence is not to give up, but to wake up. It is to walk through life not with fear of what will end, but with gratitude for what is given. When we see impermanence not as an enemy but as a teacher, every moment becomes an invitation to love more deeply, live more fully, and let go more freely. If we look deeply, most of the worries we carry each day are not about the present moment, but about the past and the future. We replay mistakes we cannot undo, and we imagine problems that may never happen. The Buddha saw this tendency clearly. The restless mind, running from what has been to what might be, rarely rests in what is. To live without worry is not to erase all problems from life, but to train the mind so that it does not get lost in fear, doubt, and attachment. Daily practice is where wisdom becomes real. It is not enough to read about impermanence or to hear that clinging brings suffering. We must embody it in how we live, breathe, and respond to life. In Buddhism, daily practice is not something extraordinary, reserved for monks in temples. It is the simple way we sit, walk, breathe, eat, and speak. Each moment is an opportunity to live without worry. Begin each morning by setting an intention. This is not about controlling the entire day, but about guiding the mind toward clarity. When you wake, before reaching for your phone or worrying about tasks, take one conscious breath and say silently, "Today, I will meet life with calmness and compassion." This simple act plants a seed of awareness. You are reminding yourself that no matter what happens, your response can be grounded, not reactive. The Buddha taught that the breath is a bridge between body and mind. When the mind races with worry, return to the breath. Inhale, aware that you are breathing in. Exhale, aware that you are breathing out. Even 3 mindful breaths can interrupt the storm of anxiety. The present moment is always here, waiting. The more you train in this, the more natural it becomes. Every difficulty in life can either be fuel for worry or fuel for wisdom. The difference lies in perception. When something unpleasant arises, a delay, an illness, a loss, the habitual reaction is fear or frustration. But Buddhist practice invites us to ask, what is this teaching me about impermanence, about letting go, about compassion? When we see problems as teachers, they lose their power to overwhelm us. The mind that worries is usually focused on what is lacking, what might be taken away, or what could go wrong. Gratitude shifts that perspective. Each day, pause and notice small blessings, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of a friend's voice, the taste of food, the fact that you are alive. Gratitude does not deny challenges, it simply balances them with awareness of what is already good. A grateful mind has less room for worry. Letting go is not a single act, but a continuous practice. Each night before sleep, review the day. Notice where you held on to anger, to regret, to expectations, and then gently release them. Tell yourself, the day is done. I do not need to carry it into tomorrow. This daily letting go is like cleaning the heart. Without it, worries accumulate like dust. With it, the mind stays light and open. Simplicity is one of the greatest allies against worry. The more possessions, attachments, and endless desires we accumulate, the more anxieties follow. Daily practice of simplicity means asking, do I really need this? Does it bring peace or does it bring restlessness? A life focused on essentials, love, compassion, awareness, is naturally lighter, freer, and less burdened by worry. Worry is not part of our true nature. It is a mental habit conditioned by fear and attachment. Just as a habit can be learned, it can also be unlearned. Through daily practice, breathing, gratitude, compassion, letting go, we reshape the mind. Slowly, worry loosens its grip, and a deep trust in life emerges. To live without worry is not to live without responsibility. It is to meet life's responsibilities with a calm heart, knowing that everything is impermanent and everything can be faced one moment at a time. When the mind rests in the present, free from clinging, it discovers a natural joy, the joy of simply being alive, here and now. Why do we worry so much? Because the mind forgets its own spaciousness. We become trapped in the narrow corridor of our thoughts, replaying what if and what will happen until the present moment feels suffocating. Worry is nothing more than the mind trying to control what cannot be controlled, the future, which is not here yet, or the past, which is already gone. The Buddha taught that the root of suffering is clinging to permanence in a world of impermanence, clinging to control in a universe of constant change. When we see this truth directly, worry begins to lose its power. Instead of being dragged by endless stories of fear, we can pause, breathe, and return to this very moment. Ask yourself, what is lacking right now in this single breath? Often the answer is nothing. The air flows in, the body is alive, the present is here. All the rest, the endless concerns about tomorrow or yesterday, are shadows created by the mind. Worry will never prevent sorrow, but mindfulness can prevent unnecessary suffering. By practicing meditation, compassion, and letting go, we train ourselves to meet life as it is without resistance. Slowly, we discover a gentle freedom, the ability to live without being enslaved by fear. So why worry so much? Life is already fleeting, already precious. Each moment is a gift, not to be wasted on anxiety, but to be lived with clarity, kindness, and presence. If this teaching touched your heart, take a moment to carry it with you into your daily life. And if you'd like to continue walking this path of wisdom together, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we explore timeless truths to help you live more peacefully, more mindfully, and more fully. May you be free from unnecessary worry. May you live with ease, compassion, and joy. And may you remember in each breath the simple gift of being here.